Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells like antiseptic and floor wax, the kind of smell that never quite leaves your clothes or your hair. Sarah Chen pushes her medication cart down the third-floor corridor at 2,300 hours, her movements precise and economical, the way someone moves when they've learned efficiency under fire. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, a sound like fluorescent lights have always hummed, in hospitals and bunkers and field stations where time doesn't work the same way. She's been on night shift for 7 years now, moving through these corridors like water, finding the easiest path, drawing no attention, making no demands. Her scrubs are navy blue, standard issue, and they hide what her bare arms would tell anyone paying attention, the shrapnel scars on her left shoulder, thin white lines like lightning that never fully faded, and the limp she's trained herself not to show after 12 hours of standing. The medication cart has a squeaky wheel. She's asked maintenance to fix it 4 times. They never do. Sarah stopped asking 6 months ago. The squeaking announces her arrival at each station, room 345, 346, 347, and no one looks up as she passes. This is intentional. This is the way she prefers it. Her name tag reads, S. Chen, RN. It does not read Captain. It does not read anything that matters. Room 347 is different. The patient in 347 is why she changed shifts 6 months ago, why she went from day nursing to the graveyard rotation that no one else wanted. Lance Corporal Rivera came through the ER with shrapnel wounds that looked familiar in a way that made her chest tight. Field hospitals in Kandahar treated wounds like this. She treated wounds like this. 12 years ago, before the military buried her, before the Pentagon called her into an office in Bethesda and told her that everything she'd been would have to disappear, she was the medic who stood where Rivera now stood. And then they called her back home and erased the records, reclassified the operations, told her to become someone else. Told her to become a nurse. Told her to disappear. Sarah doesn't believe in coincidence. She believes in ticking clocks and classified missions and the small mercies that sometimes arrive disguised as night shift assignments. She enters room 347 with the medication cart rolling smoothly now. The squeaky wheel always stops squeaking once you get it moving at the right speed. This is also true of most people, she's found. Rivera is awake, watching the ceiling with the glazed expression of someone who's been through enough morphine to dull the sharp edges of pain and memory both. His chart says he took shrapnel from an IED in his 4th deployment, same location where Sarah took her own shrapnel in her 7th. Room 345 is occupied by a woman recovering from appendicitis. Room 346 is empty. Room 347 has a man who used to work her job, in her location, in a different lifetime. Vitals look stable, she says, keeping her voice at the low, deferential register she's perfected over 7 years. Not shy. Just quiet. Any pain above a 4. Rivera blinks at her. Recognition doesn't cross his face. He was 3rd rotation when she was 1st rotation. They work different schedules, different surgical teams. The military had a way of keeping people compartmentalized. She would never have expected him to remember her. 3, he says. His voice sounds like a man who's gargled sand. Maybe 3-5. The usual. Sarah changes his dressing with movements that look learned from a textbook. In reality, they're learned from 12 years of field hospital work, splint wounds in the backs of helicopters, perform triage in mud, assess for shock while incoming fire cracks overhead. Her hands move with the terrible precision of muscle memory, the kind that lives in your bones and comes back when you're not thinking about it. She's careful with the left side of his abdomen where the shrapnel went in. She's careful with the way her own left shoulder aches in sympathy. Scars remember other scars. Good healing trajectory, she says, her voice still deferential. The sutures are holding clean. No signs of infection. She's reaching for fresh gauze, the rolls are in the cart, size 4x4, sterile, from a supply company that processes 847 kits per day for Cedar Creek alone, when Dr. Mercer appears in the doorway. His shoes click on the linoleum the way expensive shoes click when they're not meant to be on linoleum. His posture fills the doorway with the kind of presence that makes the air pressure change, the way a storm system changes humidity just by arriving. He has the look of someone who's never questioned whether he belonged in a room. He has the look of someone whose belonging has never been questioned by anyone else. His eyes land on Sarah and his expression shifts. It's subtle, a slight compression of the lips, a narrowing of the gaze, but she feels it the way prey feels the moment a predator notices them. "Who approved this dressing change?" he asks. His voice is smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to being listened to. The post-surgical protocol at Cedar Creek specifies a physician oversight for anything beyond standard vitals. Sarah finishes the gauze wrap. Her hands don't tremble. Her hands have held people's lives together while helicopters shook around her. A difficult doctor is barely a tremor in that kind of history. Standard wound assessment, she says, keeping her tone even. Checking for infection, confirming healing trajectory. No deviation from protocol. And yet, Dr. Mercer says, stepping into the room with the casual confidence of someone who believes his presence improves any situation, "You're here at night. Alone. Performing assessments that require physician training." He doesn't look at Rivera. He looks at Sarah the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that's been moved to the wrong place in a room. Sarah steps back from the patient bed and holds the used dressing materials in her hands. They're warm. They smell like antiseptic and old blood, the smell she's learned to recognize as information. This is healing, this is infection, this is time working in the patient's favor or against it. Pain is information. Blood is information. The smell of a wound tells you everything if you've trained yourself to listen. "I was finishing up," she says. Her voice is quieter now. Smaller. The voice of someone who knows her place. "The patient's stable." Of course the patient is stable, Dr. Mercer says, and something in his tone suggests he's never been wrong about whether a patient is stable. That would be because of the physician care provided during daylight hours. "What I'm concerned with is the scope creep happening during night shift. It's how mistakes happen. It's how lawsuits start." He glances at Rivera. "I'll be noting this in the chart. Standard physician reassessment will be performed each morning until discharge." He turns and leaves the room without waiting for a response. His shoes click back down the corridor, past room 346, past the empty station where the night nurse sits recording vitals on computers that hum with the same frequency as the fluorescent lights. Sarah stands with the used dressing material still in her hands and doesn't move for 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she's not thinking about Dr. Mercer. She's thinking about a medic station in Kandahar, about hands steady enough to insert a 14-gauge angiocath needle between a patient's ribs when a tension pneumothorax was minutes away from becoming cardiac arrest. She's thinking about the Silver Star citation that was classified the same day it was written. She's thinking about the Pentagon calling her into an office and saying, "You don't exist anymore. The mission never happened. You served, Captain, and now you'll stop." "He seems like he's got some personal stuff going on," Rivera says quietly from the bed. He's not looking at her. He's looking at the ceiling again, the way men look when they're trying not to think about pain. "Doctors usually do," Sarah says. She disposes of the dressing materials in the biohazard container, a red bag marked with the international symbol for danger, and washes her hands at the sink. The water is warm. The soap smells like nothing, which is the only way hospital soap ever smells. When she finishes, she touches the inside of her jacket, just above her ribs, where the faded unit patch is sewn into the lining. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. A patch from a unit that was never supposed to exist as far as the classified record is concerned. A patch that came back from Kandahar when Captain Sarah Chen didn't. "You military?" Rivera asks. His voice is different now. Sharper. Like something in his head just connected. Sarah stops moving. She's very still for a moment. When she speaks, her voice is steady. "No," she says. "Just a nurse." But she doesn't look at him as she says it, and something in the way she says it, the way the words carry a weight they shouldn't carry, makes Rivera quiet in a way that suggests he understands that some questions don't get answered in rooms where the walls might listen. Outside, rain begins to hammer the hospital windows like applause for something no one in the building can see, something happening in the dark where most people are sleeping. Sarah pushes her medication cart toward room 346, the squeaky wheel announcing her arrival, her presence, her invisibility. No one looks up. No one ever does. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would come later when the machine in room 347 would start alarming, when Lance Corporal Rivera's oxygen saturation would begin dropping with the speed of someone's life ending in real time, when Sarah would have exactly 2 minutes before cardiac arrest became inevitable, and when she would have to choose between staying invisible and staying alive. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the windows of Cedar Creek Medical when Dr. Mercer began his rounds, his white coat trailing behind him like the cape of someone who believed he owned the building. 8 residents followed in his wake, their notebooks ready, their spines straight, their expressions carefully neutral. They knew what was coming. They always did. He stopped at room 347 without warning, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. Lance Corporal Rivera lay in the bed, his breathing steady but labored, his chest tubes draining amber fluid into collection canisters. Sarah was finishing her morning assessment when Mercer's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Nurse Chen. Come here." She straightened, her tablet held against her ribs, her face composed. The resident's eyes shifted toward her with the hunger of spectators who had learned to enjoy the show. She walked over in 7 steps, she counted them without meaning to, a habit from a different life in a different desert where counting footsteps meant staying alive. "Explain your assessment of this patient's respiratory status," Mercer said. Not a question. A command wrapped in the tone of a man who already knew her answer would disappoint him. Sarah's voice stayed level, clinical. Bilateral breath sounds equal and clear. Oxygen saturation holding at 97% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Chest tube output decreased from 1.2 liters yesterday to 800 milliliters overnight. His work of breathing has improved. I asked for clinical assessment, not a correspondence course recitation. Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes, it never did. Do they teach actual anatomy where you got your degree, or just how to follow orders like a good soldier? The word landed like a punch disguised as a compliment. One of the residents actually smirked, a quick flash of teeth. Another one looked at his shoes. Sarah's jaw clenched exactly once, a muscle tightening for half a second before her face smoothed back to professional neutrality. Her hands remained perfectly steady on the tablet. She didn't look away. She didn't flush. She didn't defend herself. "Is there a specific assessment you'd like me to document differently, doctor?" Her voice was soft, deferential, the voice of someone who believed she occupied a smaller space in the world. Mercer waved his hand as though swatting away an insect. "Just continue your observations. Try to think a little deeper next time." He turned back to the residents, already moving toward the next bed, and the group flowed around Sarah like water around a stone. She felt their eyes slide away from her as they departed. She felt the weight of her own competence sitting in her chest like something she was not permitted to acknowledge. The vending machine was on the 3rd floor near the oncology ward, a place where Mercer rarely appeared unless he was making rounds. Sarah had timed it that way. She was alone when his reflection appeared in the glass, his presence announced by the faint smell of expensive cologne and the particular silence that followed him like a shadow. "You know what I love about nurses like you, Chen." His voice was conversational, almost friendly. Almost worse. You've memorized just enough to sound competent to patients who don't know better. It's almost cute, like watching a parrot repeat phrases it doesn't understand. 2 nurses turned the corner 50 feet away, saw Mercer, and suddenly became very interested in the medication dispensary. Sarah inserted her dollar bill into the slot. The machine hummed. Her hands did not shake. The muscle memory was precise, the same calm that had let her work field aid stations under fire, that had let her hold pressure on exit wounds while mortar rounds shook the ground beneath her, that had let her breathe steadily when everything was trying to kill her. She selected black coffee. The cup dropped. I can make some calls if you need a career adjustment, Mercer continued, his voice dropping, intimate in a way that made the words feel like a threat wrapped in gentleness. Somewhere more suited to your background. Sarah retrieved her coffee. The cup was warm. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly as broken as it had always been. "Thank you, doctor," she said, and turned away without waiting for a response. She walked past the medication dispensary without accelerating, without any sign that her heartbeat had moved beyond normal parameters. Her breathing remained even. Her face remained a mask. The parrot he'd compared her to had just become a bird of prey learning to hide its talons. That evening, during the 9 o'clock medication distribution, she questioned one of his antibiotic orders for Rivera. The culture results had come back that afternoon, sensitive only to 3 drugs, and the one Mercer had prescribed was not among them. Sarah checked the results twice. The laboratory report was unmistakable. She found him at the nurse's station, his computer screen glowing in the overhead fluorescent wash. "Doctor, I wanted to confirm the antibiotic coverage for Rivera." She kept her voice soft, appropriate to the hour. The culture from his chest tube came back resistant to the cephalosporin you ordered. "He'll need meropenem instead, or possibly the clindamycin-gentamicin combination." Mercer looked at her the way a man might look at someone who had just suggested he couldn't read. "Are you contradicting my clinical judgment, Nurse Chen?" His hand moved toward his telephone, a gesture slow enough to be deliberate. "Because I can have security escort you out for insubordination right now. Would you like me to make that call?" His fingers hovered over the digits. His expression said he wanted her to refuse, to push back, to give him the excuse he was waiting for. Sarah looked at his hand, at the phone, at the $500 watch visible beneath his sleeve cuff. Then she looked back at his face. "No, doctor," she said. "I just wanted to make sure the order was intentional." He smiled, thin-lipped and satisfied. "It was. Thank you for your concern." She documented his order exactly as written. Word for word. She did not add her own assessment to the chart, though protocol permitted it. She did not file a quality assurance report, though the medication error, because that's what it was, and they both knew it, would likely result in treatment failure and longer hospital stay. She simply recorded his decision and moved on to the next patient, the next task, the next small surrender. At shift change, when the day nurses came through and the night shift nurses began preparing to leave, Sarah was still on the unit. The supply closet was a narrow space between the medication dispensary and the orthopedic equipment storage, barely wide enough for a person to stand without brushing the shelves on either side. She slipped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The darkness was nearly complete, just a thin strip of light beneath the door, enough to see the shapes of boxes and bottles but nothing more. She leaned against the shelves and finally exhaled. The breath came out long and controlled, the kind of exhale that had come from deep in the muscle memory of someone who had learned that composure was armor. Her hands, still steady, unclenched. The tension that had lived in her shoulders all day, from grand rounds to vending machine to medication error to documented surrender, finally released like a spring that had been held too long under pressure. This is what invisibility cost. This is what it meant to wear a civilian name and civilian scrubs and let a man mock competence he couldn't recognize. This is what happened when you agreed to disappear, when you let the Pentagon bury your service record so deep that even a medal ceremony would have violated your classification level. You became a parrot. You became expendable. You became small. 3 hours later, at an all-night diner on Bull Street with rain hammering the windows like applause for a show nobody wanted to see, Sarah sat in a corner booth and watched her coffee go cold. The cup was white ceramic with a thin blue stripe around the rim, the kind of cup that had been used 1,000,000 times by 1,000,000 tired people in 1,000,000 different cities. The coffee inside had gone from hot to lukewarm to the temperature of surrender. The clock on the wall read 3:13 a.m. She had not slept. She would not sleep. This was part of the rhythm now: work until midnight, drive through empty streets until 3, sit in an establishment where no one asked questions, and wait for the sun to rise so she could do it all again. Her reflection stared back at her from the rain-streaked window, a ghost in scrubs, a shadow of a woman who had once been a captain. The classified operation had erased her existence officially. The Pentagon had scrubbed her records, told her never to surface, paid her a pension through channels so buried in bureaucratic labyrinth that even the IRS couldn't follow the trail. They had given her a new name, a new social security number, a new life built on the foundation of a death that had never officially happened. And she had accepted it because the alternative was worse, staying in the world where people knew what she'd done, where photographs existed, where the enemy had names and addresses and very long memories. But this slow-motion burial in a hospital where a man with a $500 watch got to decide if her competence mattered? This was not what she had signed up for when she'd agreed to disappear. The coffee was still cold. The rain was still falling. And in room 347, Lance Corporal Rivera was sleeping, his breathing steady, his oxygen saturation holding, unaware that the person tending to him had once saved his life in a different country under different circumstances, and was now saving it again while pretending she was small enough to deserve the treatment a lesser man could dispense. She lifted the cup and took a sip. The coffee tasted like cold decisions made in the middle of the night. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Sarah sat in the break room at 11:44 p.m., watching the wall clock tick past the midnight threshold into Tuesday, her shift report already filed away. Room 347 stayed quiet. Rivera slept with the kind of stillness that came from morphine and the body's mercy, a medic finally permitted to rest. She had checked on him 4 times. His stats were stable. His breathing was even. He was safe, and that small fact anchored her through the rest of the night in a way she didn't have words for. But the roster had changed. She noticed it first in the assignment board outside the nurse's station. Her name appeared next to different room numbers than the week before. All of them bedridden. All of them post-op. All of them the kind of cases that required constant intervention, vitals every hour, pain management every 2, wound checks and antibiotic scheduling, and the 1,000 small decisions that ate time and generated documentation. Her previous patients, the stable ones, the dialysis patient in 341 who needed mostly monitoring and conversation, the post-op hip replacement in 339 who was already walking and talking and healing on schedule, those names now appear beside the names of other nurses. Strategic. Sarah didn't need to wonder who had done it. She had seen Mercer in the hallway that morning, speaking with the charge nurse Diane, his voice carrying the weight of medical authority in a way that made it sound like suggestion but felt like mandate. "I'd like Chen reassigned to higher acuity cases," he'd said, loud enough to be overheard. "For the learning opportunity. She seems to need more exposure to complex procedures." The move was brilliant in its cruelty. He wasn't removing her from the ward. He was giving her enough rope to hang herself with. High-acuity patients meant longer hours, more chances for error, more documentation of every single thing she did or failed to do. Every medication delay, every moment she spent with one patient instead of another, every small imperfection would now be visible, measurable, recordable. Sarah pulled up the patient files on her tablet. Room 334, post-operative spinal fusion, pain management required every 90 minutes, drain output monitoring every 2 hours. Room 336, pneumonia with chronic COPT, respiratory status requiring constant vigilance. Room 340, newly admitted diabetic foot wound, debridement scheduled for tomorrow at 0600, infection control protocols mandatory. Room 347, Lance Corporal Rivera. At least they'd left her with him. She finished her coffee and moved through the ward at the start of her rounds, entering each room with the same methodical precision she'd learned in field hospitals where time was measured in minutes and mistakes were measured in lives. The spinal fusion patient was sleeping, pain controlled. The COP patient's oxygen saturation was holding at 94%. The diabetic's foot showed no signs of spreading infection. The work was absorbing in a way that made time compress. By 01:47 hours, she'd completed 2 full rounds and was preparing for the 3rd when she decided to check Rivera one more time before the ward settled into the deepest part of night. The moment she opened his door, something changed in the air. His oxygen saturation reading showed 91%. Not dangerous yet. Not alarming, but dropping. She'd seen numbers like that before, seen them in patterns that meant nothing and patterns that meant everything. She moved to the monitor, watching the waveform, watching the number climb back up to 92%, then drift down again. 91%. His breathing was fast. Shallow. The kind of breathing that looked fine on the surface but meant something underneath was breaking. She placed her hand on his chest. The rise and fall was uneven. Right side moving less than left. She moved her stethoscope. The right lung was silent. Completely silent. No air movement. No breath sounds. Nothing. Her hands remembered. Her body remembered. The same pattern she'd seen in Kandahar when IED shrapnel had punctured a Marine's pleural space, when air had started accumulating in the space between lung and chest wall, when the pressure kept building until the lung collapsed and the heart followed. Tension pneumothorax. She could see it starting to show in his face, the subtle graying, the rise of his neck veins. His trachea was deviating left, pushing toward his heart. The pressure was building. She hit the code button. The call went out across the intercom, RN Chen, room 347. She grabbed the crash cart and positioned it in the room, her movement smooth and practiced, each item pulled precisely where she needed it. Oxygen reservoir mask. 14-gauge angiocath needles, still in their sealed packages. Chest tube set up in case she needed it. The room became a controlled space around her, a small circle of light and purpose in the middle of the night. Mercer appeared in the doorway before anyone else did. He was holding his morning presentation materials, still dressed in the clothes he'd worn for chart review, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power waiting for engagement. His eyes went to the monitor, registered the saturation number, registered the silent right lung on the ultrasound screen. For a moment, his face was pure calculation. "Step back, Nurse Chen." "I've got this," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no in a clinical setting. He moved toward the bed with deliberate authority, beginning to set up for a chest tube insertion, the full surgical procedure, the one that required sterile field and careful technique and 8 to 10 minutes of uninterrupted work. His hands moved with the confidence of 100 successful insertions. He was right. He was trained. He was the attending physician. And he was going to take too long. "Dr. Mercer," Sarah said, her voice level and low, not a question but a statement of fact. "He needs decompression now. We don't have time for the tube insertion." Mercer didn't even look up from his sterile field. "I said step back." "That's an order." Rivera's oxygen saturation had dropped to 88%. His lips were taking on the faint blue tint of cyanosis. The pressure in his chest was building toward the moment when his heart wouldn't be able to pump, when everything downstream would shut down, when the window for intervention would close forever. Sarah watched the number drop to 86%. Watched Mercer position his instruments. Watched the man who had replaced her, the medic who had taken her position in Kandahar and taken shrapnel doing the exact job she used to do, dying in front of her while protocol moved at its careful pace. Her hands moved before her mind finished catching up. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle, already unwrapped, already ready. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line, muscle memory took over, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks, the rib, the space between where the pressure was building. She pushed past Mercer, past his sound of outrage, and inserted the needle in one smooth motion. The hiss of air escaping was a sound like exhaling after holding your breath underwater. Rivera's chest wall relaxed immediately, the pressure releasing, the compressed lung beginning to re-expand. His oxygen saturation climbed, 85%, 87%, 90%. His breathing eased. His lips shifted from blue toward pink. The pressure under his sternum, the weight that had been crushing him, began to lift. Mercer's face went white, then red, then into a shade of purple that looked like it belonged on a medical student's chart about hypertensive crisis. He stood there holding his sterile instruments, his procedure suddenly unnecessary, his authority suddenly overridden, his clinical decision suddenly, demonstrably, measurably, publicly, wrong. "You just assaulted my patient," he said, his voice quiet and precise in a way that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You just performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Security. Now." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah had known exactly what would happen when she made her choice. She had known that saving Rivera's life meant ending her own here. That the woman who had spent weeks absorbing his mockery without flinching, who had perfected the art of invisible competence, who had survived classification and erasure and the slow-motion destruction of her career, had just committed the one act that would guarantee the ending he'd been working toward all along. She stepped back from the bed. She set the needle on the tray. She looked at Mercer, really looked at him, and something in her eyes made the attending physician take a small step backward, even as his rage was building into a roar. Security was already moving through the ward. Sarah could hear their radios crackling, hear their footsteps accelerating toward room 347. She did not run. She did not cry. She did not try to explain that needle decompression was the standard of care for tension pneumothorax, that the time it would have taken to set up a surgical chest tube was time that Rivera didn't have, that every textbook and every protocol and every field medicine manual she'd ever trained on supported her decision. She simply stood beside the bed, watching Rivera's oxygen saturation hold steady at 92%, watching his breathing normalize, watching the man she had once served with begin to breathe like someone who would live to see tomorrow. And in that moment, alone with the sound of his stable heart monitor and Mercer's voice calling for her removal, Sarah Chen felt something shift in the weight she'd been carrying. The needle was steady in Sarah's gloved hand. The rush of air, the distinctive hiss that every field medic learns in their first week, confirmed what her eyes and ears already knew. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Death on a timer, and the timer was running out. Rivera's oxygen saturation climbed. 90. 92. The mechanical ventilator stopped fighting him. His chest expanded without the rigid resistance of a lung compressed against the mediastinum, and his blood pressure, which had been dropping like a stone, stabilized at a number that meant survival instead of a body bag. She didn't pull the needle out yet. That came later, after the proper chest tube, after the thoracic surgeon assessed whether he needed surgery. For now, the needle was a temporary decompression, a pressure release valve, the difference between Lance Corporal Rivera living to see his daughter's second birthday and not living to see anything again. Sarah set the needle down on the sterile field. Her hands were perfectly steady. She could have been placing a coffee cup on a table in Kandahar, calm as stone while rockets landed 2 blocks away and the Marines around her were bleeding out on canvas stretchers. The screaming happened later, after the work was done. During the work, there was only the work. The monitor's beeping held its rhythm. Sinus. Normal. The kind of heartbeat that belonged to a man who was going to wake up. The door opened 17 seconds later. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway, still in his silk pajamas, the ones with the monogram, the ones that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His eyes moved across the room, the decompressed chest tube set up, the blood on Sarah's scrubs, the needle in her trembling hand. No. The needle in her steady hand. There was no trembling. There was never trembling when it mattered. "What," Mercer said, "did you do?" Sarah met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression. Second and third intercostal space, midclavicular line. He was going to die in approximately 4 minutes. Oxygen saturation is now 92%. Blood pressure is stable. Her voice came out level and clinical, the way a nurse should sound when she was delivering a patient report to a physician. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just facts, delivered like medications. Mercer's jaw tightened. She could see the moment he understood she had saved the patient. She had done his job. She had made him look incompetent, which was something Dr. Mercer could not, under any circumstances, tolerate. He turned without another word and walked out of the room. Sarah's hands finally steadied. They were already steady, but now they steadied in a different way, the way a hand steadies when it knows what's coming. She stripped off her gloves with 2 sharp snaps, the latex peeling away from her wrists like shed skin. She placed the needle in the biohazard container. She pulled the blood-soaked paper towels from the bedside and disposed of them. She was washing her hands at the sink when the phone rang in room 347, the call button, but not the call button. The overhead speaker. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. Not her problem. Not her responsibility anymore. Not for the next 12 hours, maybe longer, depending on what Mercer said and who believed him. She was still in her scrubs when he found her 20 minutes later, walking out of the supply closet with a fresh box of gloves. Mercer was on his phone, his voice moving with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted on the first request. Medical director, he was saying. Yes, I need you here immediately. No, this can't wait until morning. We have a scope of practice violation. A nurse, yes, one of our nurses, just performed a 14-gauge needle decompression without a physician order. Invasive procedure. Unauthorized. Completely outside her scope. Yes, the patient is stable now, but that's beside the point. This is about protocol. This is about hospital policy. This is about insubordination. He paused, listening. Yes. Nurse Chen. I'll have her wait in my office. He hung up and looked at Sarah with something that almost resembled a smile. My office. Now. The walk through Cedar Creek's corridors felt like moving through water. Sarah's muscles remembered every step from a life that didn't exist anymore, walking through FOB Shank after a bad extraction, walking through a combat support hospital in Helmand Province with wounded draped across her shoulders, walking through darkness knowing that every footstep was observed, catalogued, judged. This felt like all of those. This felt like a walk toward a judgment she'd already received. Mercer's office was exactly what Sarah expected: mahogany desk, leather chairs, medical school diploma from Johns Hopkins arranged at the precise angle that suggested importance. The walls smelled like expensive cologne and the particular emptiness of a space designed to intimidate. She sat without being asked. That was the thing they taught you in the military: don't ask for permission you already have. The medical director arrived at 0340 hours. His name was Benjamin Shaw, and he looked the way most administrators looked when they'd been pulled out of bed at 3 in the morning, rumpled, irritated, ready to get this over with. Mercer, however, looked more awake than Sarah had ever seen him. He looked like a man who had finally found the tool he needed. Thank you for coming, Mercer said. I need to file a formal complaint regarding Nurse Chen's conduct during the night shift. At 0200 hours, I was called to ICU for a patient deterioration, Lance Corporal Rivera, post-operative day 3, traumatic pneumothorax secondary to shrapnel fragmentation. He paused, letting the medical detail hang in the air like evidence. When I arrived, Nurse Chen was already performing an invasive procedure, specifically, a needle decompression, without my order, without my presence, and without any authorization to do so. She had penetrated the chest wall with a 14-gauge needle without a physician's direct supervision. Shaw was looking at Sarah now. His expression had moved from irritated to serious. I saved his life, Sarah said. The quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that happens in ICU waiting rooms when someone has just said something true and unforgivable at the same time. You what? Shaw asked. He was in tension pneumothorax. Oxygen saturation dropping, it was 68% when I arrived. Blood pressure 82/51. He had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. Sarah's voice stayed flat, clinical. The voice of a nurse delivering information, not a woman defending her life. I decompressed the chest. Air in the pleural space is now relieved. He stabilized immediately. Oxygen is 92%. Blood pressure is 110/72. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. He's alive because of that needle. Because you, Mercer said, practice medicine without a license. Because I followed protocol for a tension pneumothorax. Sarah looked at him. Needle decompression is a nursing intervention in emergency settings. It's in every trauma protocol in this hospital. The question isn't whether I did it, the question is why you arrived 10 minutes late and chose a slower procedure while the patient was dying. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone in the corridor outside Mercer's office was moving supplies on a cart, the wheels squeaking against the tile in that way that suggested 3 a.m. and nobody else awake to hear it. Regardless, Mercer said, his voice steady as a scalpel, she acted without authorization. She took a decision that should have been mine. She undermined my authority as the attending physician. And frankly, her pattern of insubordination has been escalating for weeks. This is just the latest incident in a long pattern of behavior that suggests she believes she's qualified to do things she's not trained for. Shaw was pinching the bridge of his nose. Sarah recognized the gesture of a man trying to make a decision between two bad options. I need to place her on immediate suspension pending investigation, Shaw said finally. This is too significant to overlook. We have to follow protocol, regardless of the outcome. Policy is policy, and policy exists to protect the hospital. Sarah nodded. She had expected this. She had known, the moment she pushed the needle between Rivera's ribs, that this was the consequence. You don't save a life and then get to keep your career, not when the life you save belongs to someone who reminds you of who you used to be, not when the man who called you into this moment is the kind of man who measures his worth in the power he can take from others. Your badge, Shaw said. Your hospital ID. You're escorted out immediately. Security will accompany you to collect your personal items from your locker. You're not to return to the unit. You're not to contact patients. You're not to speak with staff about this matter pending the investigation. Sarah reached up and unclipped her badge from her lanyard. The photograph showed a woman who looked like her but wasn't, the version of Sarah who'd agreed to be nobody, to shrink herself down to a size that fit into the space Mercer had defined for her. She set the badge on Shaw's desk with the kind of deliberation usually reserved for placing a casket into the ground. She walked out through the emergency department at 03 for 7 hours. Her scrubs were still blood-stained, Rivera's blood, the blood of a man she'd known in a life that didn't officially exist. The security guard walked 3 paces behind her, not close enough to be obvious but close enough to ensure she didn't suddenly decide to breach protocol a second time. Another violation. Another line crossed. The night air hit her like a slap when she stepped outside. Summer heat, already pressing down even at this hour, the kind of Georgia humidity that clung to your skin and made breathing feel like drowning in air. She could see the parking lot stretching out in front of her, rows of cars, most of them belonging to people sleeping in their homes, to people who got to go home after their shifts and exist as human beings instead of walking violations. She drove to Highway 80 and parked in front of the Waffle House, the one that never closed, the one that existed for people like her, the ones who had nowhere else to be at 3 a.m. and couldn't sleep anyway. She sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and stared at her reflection in the dark glass. The patch inside her jacket lining, the faded unit patch, the one with the emblem of her team, the one that proved she'd belonged to something once, felt heavier than it ever had before. She touched it through the fabric of her jacket, the way some people touch rosaries or lucky coins. Kandahar. 23 people extracted. 1 classified operation. 1 ordered disappearance. 1 woman erased so completely that her own heroism became a liability, became the thing that would destroy her because she couldn't stay silent when silence meant death. She had saved Rivera's life using the skills the Pentagon had ordered her to bury. And now those skills would be investigated, questioned, dissected by people who didn't understand that sometimes you don't wait for a physician's authorization when a man is dying. Sometimes you just act. Sometimes you save him. And sometimes that salvation becomes your execution. The coffee went cold in the cup. Outside, the sky began its slow shift from black to gray to the pale washed-out blue that came right before dawn. A delivery truck pulled into the parking lot. The world was waking up, and Sarah Chen was still sitting in a booth at a Waffle House on Highway 80, wearing scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and blood, wondering if the classified operation that had erased her existence from official record had been worth this slow-motion professional burial. She didn't notice when the next shift started. She didn't notice the hospital waking up without her. She didn't notice anything except the weight of the patch inside her jacket and the certainty that the secret she'd kept, the one about who she was and what she'd done, was about to stop being a secret, whether the Pentagon wanted it to or not. The fluorescent lights in the diner buzzed the same way they'd buzzed in Cedar Creek's corridors. Everything sounded the same. Everything felt like dying. And then, at 0600 hours, something changed. At 0600 hours, the ICU monitors beat their monotonous rhythm, and Lance Corporal Rivera's eyes opened. Not the half-conscious flutter of sedation wearing off. Full awareness. His pupils dilated, tracking the figure standing at his bedside, and something shifted in his face, recognition, and then gratitude so profound it cracked the composure of a Marine who'd been trained to feel nothing. Sarah's hand rested on the fall line, and Rivera's lips moved, barely audible, forming a single word, phantom. That had been her call sign in Kandahar. For years buried. For years classified. For years dissolved into the identity of a night shift nurse at Cedar Creek Medical. Nobody here knew that name. Nobody was supposed to know that name. But Rivera remembered. And he whispered it to the corpsman standing at the foot of his bed, a young Marine volunteer who'd been visiting the trauma ward since the admission came through, somebody with a radio clipped to his belt and a face that suddenly went very still. The corpsman stepped into the hallway. 30 seconds. That's all it took. A call made on a secure line, a message cascading through channels that didn't officially exist, words passed from officer to officer in a chain that moved faster than administrative paperwork and twice as certain. 200 Marines in dress blues flooded Cedar Creek's lobby by 0700 hours. They arrived in formation, boots on marble tile, the sound like distant thunder rolling through a valley. Every corridor they walked, the civilian staff froze. Nurses pressed themselves against walls. Orderlies stopped mid-stride. A color guard assembled in the main atrium, flags held at port arms, their uniforms so crisp the creases looked like they could cut glass. The Marines said nothing. They stood at attention in perfect ranks, and their presence transformed the hospital lobby into something that looked less like a medical facility and more like the moment before a national funeral or a revolution. Security tried to move Sarah out through the staff exit at 0700, just as they'd been instructed by Dr. Mercer 16 hours earlier. But the security chief took 3 steps toward the elevator and saw the formation in the lobby and stopped walking. He picked up his radio. His supervisor picked up hers. No one moved. By 0715, the entire Cedar Creek administration knew something had changed, though nobody could yet articulate what. That was when Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Halloway stepped forward, 5 chevrons, a chest full of ribbons earned in places the mainstream media never covered, bearing a leather folder that had traveled with him from Arlington, and read Sarah Chen's Silver Star citation in a voice that made the hospital PA system seem redundant. For gallantry in action against enemy forces on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, Captain Sarah Chen, call sign Phantom, willingly exposed herself to direct fire, while providing emergency medical intervention that saved the lives of 8 wounded personnel, including a fellow Marine later rendered unconscious by combat conditions. Her courage under fire and medical expertise were instrumental in the survival of her unit. Each word landed like a hammer against anvil. Captain Sarah Chen. Not a nurse. A captain. A combat veteran. A war hero no one in Savannah had known they were employing. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd at 0720, shoving past dress blues with the arrogance of a man who still believed the hospital was his domain and protocol was his language. What is this? What is the meaning of this display? His voice cracked higher with each word, and the Marines, silent, disciplined, immobile, simply turned their heads to watch him. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just looked at him the way a predator looks at prey that hasn't yet realized it's been hunted. That was when a 3-star general stepped from the crowd, dress uniform so laden with medals it seemed to bend light. He walked directly to Sarah, still wearing her scrubs, still carrying the weight of yesterday's suspension and tomorrow's unemployment, and he saluted, fist to chest, arm extended, the gesture of one warrior honoring another. Captain Chen. Your service is noted. 3 words. In the presence of 200 Marines, in the hospital where she'd been escorted out like a criminal 16 hours ago, a general officer was recognizing her. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their nervous frequency. Mercer's face had gone the color of old medical waste. "This is a hospital, not a parade ground." The same words he'd screamed at her when the color guard assembled. But this time, the words didn't land. This time, a Pentagon liaison, middle-aged woman in a charcoal suit, carrying an iPad like a weapon, stepped forward and extended it toward Mercer. Not a request. Not a courtesy. A command performed in the shape of a gesture. He took it with shaking hands. What he saw made his skin go absolutely white. The screen displayed Sarah's service jacket, redacted in 17 places with black marker and stamped with 2 words in letters that seemed to grow larger every second he stared: Captain. Classified. 23 years of medical school pedigree, 17 years of hospital advancement, countless hours spent dismantling her credibility, all of it evaporated in the 30 seconds it took for him to understand that he'd been spending his ammunition on an opponent whose actual rank he was not authorized to know existed. The Marines began moving at 0730, splitting into 2 columns, a passageway of dress blues that led directly from the lobby to the elevator where Sarah stood. She walked between them, not escorted, walking with the gait of someone who'd just remembered how to command space, and Rivera's room was on the 3rd floor, and when she arrived, he was sitting up in bed with an oxygen mask and tears running down his face and hands that tried to salute despite the 4 lines, and she said, "At ease, Lance Corporal," and he collapsed against his pillow, nodding once. The viral video reached 200,000 views by 1200 hours. Arrogant doctor screams a decorated war hero. The headline was in 12 news feeds by noon, the thumbnail image of Mercer's contorted face preserved forever in social media amber, his voice still raw in the audio. "This is a hospital, not a parade ground." The comment sections filled with combat veterans, current active duty, families of soldiers who'd been saved by people in scrubs who nobody gave credentials to. #Phantom started trending by 1400 hours. Medical boards across the country were receiving inquiries by 1600. The story had the shape of something that wouldn't be forgotten: institutional arrogance demolished by hidden competence, a man's carefully constructed authority shattered by the casual revelation that the person he'd been bullying had been operating under security clearances he wasn't qualified to question. Dr. Patricia Vance, retired Navy surgeon, saw the video at 1,630 hours in her study in Charleston, saw the name David Mercer below the title Board-Certified Emergency Medicine, and made a phone call that changed the subsequent 90 days of his life. Her voice, when she spoke to the Cedar Creek board chairman, carried the weight of someone who'd trained surgeons and shaped careers and who was now systematically untraining one. "That's David Mercer? The resident I trained in 2003? He just ridiculed a captain, a Marine captain, who was performing sound emergency medicine. He's screaming at a combat veteran about hospital protocol. I will not have my name associated with his career. Remove my name from his CV, remove any reference to my training. And I will be calling the state medical board myself." She hung up. Within 2 hours, the Cedar Creek Legal Department had opened a file titled Chen vs. Cedar Creek Medical's Mercer. Within 4 hours, the medical director had suspended Mercer's privileges pending investigation. Within 6 hours, staff members were coming forward with stories, the rumors he'd spread about Sarah's capabilities, the strategic schedule changes, the documented pattern of reassignments designed to create liability, the medication order he'd questioned loudly enough that residents heard it and marked it in their notes, the way he'd smiled when security escorted her out at 0300 hours. The board review examined the medical facts of the Rivera case. Tension pneumothorax, 0200 hours, deteriorating vital signs, a choice between needle decompression, faster, simpler, high-skill dependent, and chest tube insertion, which took longer but had a lower margin for error. Every physician who reviewed the case came to the same conclusion: Sarah's decision was correct. Standard of care. Emergency medicine 101. The very definition of appropriate scope of practice in a life-threatening situation. That was the moment Dr. Mercer's strategy, so carefully constructed, so deliberately executed, transformed from professional advancement into documented harassment. By Thursday, his research funding had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome. By Friday, the hospital had offered Sarah reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology signed by 3 executives. By Saturday, his medical privileges had been revoked pending investigation. By the following Wednesday, he was sitting in his emptied office, the diplomas still on the wall, the boxes half-packed, scrolling through internet comments calling him a disgrace to the medical profession, a coward, a man too small to teach residents and too petty to work alongside nurses. The comments didn't stop. They accumulated like scar tissue. The institution that had protected him had collapsed, and the one thing Mercer had never possessed, the one thing he'd spent 23 years trying to earn through credentials and connections and carefully orchestrated cruelty, was gone forever. Not titles. Not money. Respect. The respect that couldn't be purchased, only earned. The respect that Sarah had carried in silence through every humiliation, every dismissal, every moment she'd swallowed her dignity so completely that he'd convinced himself he'd actually broken her. 6 months later, Sarah walked into Cedar Creek wearing scrubs with a unit patch now visible on the outside of her jacket, no longer hidden in a lining where shame had sewn it. The patch was faded, coffee-stained, patched in places where rounds had passed nearby, and she wore it the way other people wear earned credentials. The new clinical educator for emergency services, training staff in mass casualty protocols, teaching them the decisions that separate the living from the dead, teaching them that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together. Rivera had recovered fully and now worked part-time in the same department while finishing his degree, his chest scar nearly invisible under his scrubs, his gratitude expressed in the precision with which he assisted in every procedure. It was a Tuesday afternoon, break time, and Sarah was walking toward the loading dock for air when she saw the medical supply van pulled up to the hospital's receiving entrance. The driver was alone, and he wore a company polo shirt in gray, not hospital blue, not white, not anything that suggested he had any authority within these walls anymore. Dr. Mercer lifted a box from the van's cargo hold and froze the moment he saw her. His hands went still. His shoulders tensed. He looked away quickly, the way an animal looks away from a predator that has just made eye contact, and he continued loading boxes in silence. Sarah felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. No temptation to speak. She simply touched the patch on her jacket, visible now, and felt the ghost of Rivera's steady pulse underneath her fingertips from 6 months ago, felt the memory of the hiss of air escaping the tension pneumothorax, felt the weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying since the day the military had ordered her to disappear. She walked back inside. In the break room, a new resident asked her about the silver star in the shadow box on the wall. Sarah considered her answer, then said, "That's from a different life." But the skills are the same. Medicine isn't about titles or credentials. It's about being competent when someone's dying and you're the only one who can help. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. That became the clinical educator's motto, printed on the training manual's opening page, taught to every nurse and resident who passed through Cedar Creek's emergency department. Outside, Mercer loaded the final box into his van and drove away, and Sarah returned to her training session, teaching the next generation of nurses the needle decompression technique that had saved a life and revealed a truth no classification order could bury forever. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, if you've ever had to prove yourself to someone who'd already decided you were small, please like and subscribe. Comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position? And if you know someone like Sarah, someone quiet, capable, carrying a story the world doesn't know, share this with them. They deserve to know they're not alone.